Welcome to the Loins of History, a podcast dedicated to correcting political and historical illiteracy. My name is Jay, and I'm joined by my co-host Collin, and this is our next episode in a history of U.S. and Chinese relations. We've got 2 more episodes left in this series. This episode, we are going to be just kind of looking at a comprehensive view of all U.S. and Chinese relations. We've kind of walked the dog starting in the 1830s in the First Opium War on how the U.S. and China really started getting involved with one another, both politically and economically and religiously. And we've tried the best we could to tell the story of how we got to where we are currently at today, because we believe it is super important that if you're going to understand the current state of play between the United States and China, you have to understand the history. And that history didn't start in 1950. It actually started 120-ish years prior to that. And we've attempted to tell that story in this series. So with that, Collin, you want to get us started on a recap, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a long road, but a very rewarding one. So, in the news, if anybody's been watching the news, following social media, you're seeing it looks like a growing tension between the U.S. and Chinese. I think that's been the case for the past decade or so, with rising tension in trade disparities. Obviously, that was one of Trump's big points, and Taiwan. And I think that a lot of Americans perceive the Chinese, they see the red flag, and they see the Chinese government as very similar to like the Soviet Union. And it's kind of like in the US mind, we try and see that they're communists, the Soviets, were communists. So they're one and the same, and we can treat them the same. And it's kind of the same government, same culture, same problems, same conflict, just different countries.
Feels like another Cold War.
Exactly. And that's not at all the case. As we talked about before, the Russians and the Chinese, now they're buddy-buddy now. But for a long time, they had their own Cold War. So there is a definite difference. And if we're going to continue to either bridge the gap between the Chinese, or we're going to ultimately go into conflict, we as Americans and the world writ large, our listeners worldwide, need to understand the way that China got to this point, or how China got to this point. So between the US and Chinese, let's go back to the Opium Wars. Those are some of our first episodes here. So the Opium Wars were fought between the European powers at the time, England, France, etc., and the Qing dynasty. And it's interesting that the Qing dynasty lost so badly. And I think this left kind of a scar, and this began the century of humiliation. And I think it's been deeply imprinted on the minds of the Chinese government, this catastrophic loss, because it wasn't just like World War II, where it was 2 powers going at it, and it was kind of bloody, and it was back and forth. This really was the Western powers coming in and dictating to the Qing dynasty what exactly was going to happen. The British came in with gunboats that just blew the Chinese Navy away. If you can even really call it a navy, they came in, they imposed rule over the Qing dynasty, humiliated them on the open water and militarily. And they imposed their will, and that led to the open door policy. But then not just was there a military defeat and kind of a humiliation of the Qing dynasty, because basically everything they did from that point on was as an occupied power. But with these Opium Wars, these foreign powers essentially flooded the market within China with opium. It led to this decay of society within China. So if you've ever been to like some of these major cities in the US now, you can see that open air drugs have become a real problem. And it just leaves kind of this stench on a city. And I don't just mean like a physical stench, but like a stain on a city. And you
Yeah.
see open air drug use, and you just kind of have this feeling like businesses leave, people leave the cities. They want to get out of there. It's this open air drug use. People become more violent. Crime goes through the roof. That was basically happening all over China as this opium became readily available and was encouraged and basically trafficked by European powers into the Qing dynasty. So you had this great empire subjugated to foreign powers for the first time, really, since like the Mongols, almost 700 years, 600 years before. You had the average Chinese being subjugated to drugs and
Hmm.
degradation of society. And then now you have foreign missionaries coming in who uh, did some good. They built hospitals, they built schools. If you remember, Sun Yat sen ended up going to a Christian missionary that was started by missionaries. He was educated there. So there were a lot of great things that these missionaries did. But one of the things that the Chinese now looking back on see that as an encroachment on their heritage and their history and their culture as
Mm.
trying to change it to something more westernized, something that was not Chinese. The Chinese history has been around for 3,000 years, almost 5,000 years, I guess, if you want to say that, with I think the Tang Dynasty. I'll have fact checked me on that, but it's been around for a long time, and
Yeah.
they viewed this as something so foreign that it was almost an affront to them. And if you remember, that led to the Taiping Rebellion, and the Taiping Rebellion killed 20 million people over the course of about 14 years,
Wow.
where you had someone who believed that he had received visions of Christ and led this rebellion where 20 million people were killed. Oh, and by the way, the Qing dynasty was really powerless to act against it. European powers sat back and watched it happen. This culminated with the fall of the Qing dynasty at the turn of the century and the Boxer Rebellion, if you remember that. And something I was thinking about while preparing for this episode, with the fall of the Qing dynasty, it really creates kind of not just a break, but a dividing line, almost like a gulf of history, where
Mm.
on one side you had this it's seemingly unbroken line of Chinese history, stretching
Yeah.
back to ancient times,
All these
and
different
then
dynasties.
exact dynasty after dynasty after dynasty after dynasty. And now suddenly you don't have it. Now there's a brief period where there's the Republic of China, but then there
Hmm.
was the warlord era, and then suddenly it was a civil war, and you were occupied by Japan, and then communist China began. So the fall of the Qing dynasty, I think, represents more than just another dynasty ending. It really
Mm.
was complete separation of
Yeah.
ancient China from
Yeah.
modern China. And
It's the end of China as we knew it.
so that's kind of it's kind of a bit of a hyperbole, but it's actually not.
Yeah.
Because if you fast forward to when Mao Zedong took over, they remember the four olds, get rid of it. The
Hmm.
Communist Party tried to sever any remaining vestigial ties that existed to Chinese heritage and history and culture. And that was 50 years or so after the fall of the Qing dynasty. So already those ties were tenuous at best, and now they were completely gone. And it isn't even until today, really, that a lot of the things that we look into China and see is like, oh, that's these ancient palaces, these ancient customs and things like that. A lot of that had to be brought back by like Deng Xiaoping and even Xi Jinping is as totalitarian as he is, he's trying to rekindle some of that ancient culture to give people kind of like a rudder, a guiding
Yeah.
light, if you will. So
Mao got rid of Confucius and she has brought him back.
yeah, exactly. It's interesting that everybody in the West, you can ask them, knows who Confucius is, but they probably don't know that the Chinese government tried to remove Confucius from not just history books, but just their very memory. It's like the soul of the people. And that's kind of high talk. But I mean, they really did. They tried to completely remove it from the
Yeah.
Chinese. And then so you take that into World War II, and I think about how brutal it was for the Chinese. I mean, they lost, what was it? And they're trying to stop the Japanese advance, and they flooded, I think, the Yangtze River. And they killed like 200,000 of their own people just to try and
Yeah.
stop the Japanese. There's the rape of Nanking. There was just Japanese occupation. Then the Civil War resumed. Millions and millions of people died. And that was not even, we hadn't even started the communist era yet.
Yeah.
So that, it culminates in the Civil War ending in 1949. So if you look at the centuries of humiliation, you've got a fall of a great dynasty, the end of dynasties, just mass death and destruction across the country, separation from their history and their culture. And now they go into the 100-year marathon. So I think that now a lot of Chinese leaders and people in general, they remember that in some way, like call it like ancestral memory or whatever, but they're being taught that again. And that's kind of what their guiding principle is. Like, we will not let that happen again. We are going to reestablish ourselves as the global hegemon. We are going,
Mm.
they will perform the kowtow to us again someday, because they know how bad it was. And they still feel that humiliation. Americans and Westerners writ large will kind of shake off. I feel like a lot of things like that, like political ties, as sensitive as we are in the US right now politically, we tend to shake it off and have a short memory. I don't think
Yeah.
that is, and I think the evidence is there that we've gone through. I don't think that exists in China. They see things in decades and centuries, really, whereas we're looking at election cycles.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, when you were talking about how many people died under Mao, the median estimate is that Mao killed 60 million Chinese.
That
The
is
high number is
after
actually 80 million.
That is after World War II.
That's
Mind you, that's
after World
after
War
in the
II.
Civil War. And that was still, it's crazy to think about. I don't think a lot of Westerners, what was it Stalin said, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic. A lot of people look at that number and they're just like, that's a number on a sheet. They don't really see it as, remember back to the episode we did on the Great Leap Forward, or the Leap Forward, excuse me, the Great Leap, where parents were forced to bury their children for stealing food because they were starving to death. They don't see stories like that. They see numbers on a spreadsheet. There's a lot of people who are alive now that probably still remember those days. Deng Xiaoping did. Xi Jinping probably does.
Was it the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976?
Yeah, see that, and
There
that's
are
another.
definitely people alive who remember that.
That's the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap were probably two of the most defining moments of the Mao era, and really Chinese
Hmm.
communism up until this point, because it showed what a catastrophic failure communism by itself will be, and
Hmm.
government driven economics. And then the Cultural Revolution, how, in sales and business, there's kind of this idea of like, well, you're going to get more of what you incentivize. So if you incentivize something, you're just going to get more of it. If you incentivize people at the very bottom to turn on their political enemies, and you really don't limit that incentive, it's uncapped commission on how you perform. It's only a matter of time before that spirals out of control. And that's exactly what happened, to the point that a lot of Mao's inner circle had to retake control and put a stop to it, and then jail all the people, the group of five that were in charge, the gang of five that were in charge of that, because it was so out of hand that the country was coming to a halt because nothing could get done. And oh, by the way, it looks a little familiar, because who were the leaders of that? Well, most of it was young college students, very young professionals who had, well, not even really professionals, very young people out of the university who were the most ardent adherents to Maoism. And, there's the famous picture of Song Bin Bin, the teenager at the time, her putting the red armband on Mao.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very, very propagandized photo. But they were the most ardent adherents to it. They were beating professors, and it's interesting that within a matter of decades, in typical Chinese culture, you had this reverence in Confucianism. You had this reverence for your elders and
Hmm.
taking care of the elderly and your parents and your family. And it was almost like a complete inversion of that, where the young were now beating the old, and these people that were in positions of authority and commanded respect and had knowledge and wisdom that they were trying to pass down were suddenly like cast out and beaten publicly
Yeah.
by essentially children. So it's a time in Chinese history that I think every American, really, everybody in China as well, should study. I think that's one of the most important time periods for them to study pieces of history within Chinese history.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, we've talked a lot about like mm, the last 150, almost 200 years of Chinese history. What do you think are some central like themes regarding China's relationship to the United States during that time?
Economics. I think that is one of the most, that is, if not the central, one of these central points. And,
Yeah,
I think
trade.
the trade is, it's not just trade, but, there's going to be market manipulation. There's going to be currency wars, who's buying whose debt, who can invest and divest capital in other, this great game that's going on of economics between the United States and China. It goes more than just trade. Trade is a huge part of it. Supply, controlling central points in the supply chain, and economics will be used to almost have proxy conflicts and smaller economic conflicts, because look all over where China's building the belt, the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road, if you will. Where are they building these ports? Where are they building these highways, these roads? A lot of them are going through Central Asia and the Middle East, somewhere where the United States has had a lot of interest in. We have military bases all over there, all over the Horn of Africa and East Coast of Africa. I think they have a port now on the Atlantic side of Africa as well, where they're building all of these ports so they can extend their supply chain and their network. And not only that, but so then that they can buy, may not be the right word, but then they can curry favor with these countries, because they're bringing economic aid, really, through investment that the United States may not be to them. So suddenly now that they have an ally on their side because they're bringing them money. Look in Djibouti. There's a lot of U.S. forces in Djibouti. Well, there's also the Chinese ports all over in Djibouti, and they're pouring money in Djibouti, Ethiopia, Sudan, all over right there. That is um, the Gulf right there it's a extremely
Yeah.
valuable.
Yeah. Well, the Red Sea is,
The Red Sea, excuse me.
the southern access to the Suez Canal. Like it's what connects Europe to Asia.
Right. So
So that's a
economics.
huge location, strategic location.
Yeah, I mean, remember when the Suez Canal got blocked for like 2 days and like trade shut down for weeks, or it caused backups for weeks. It's the same thing. So it's no longer just, well, what's the trade, the balance? Are we doing the trade agreements balanced? It's now, where are we investing money in all these other countries? Where are we building infrastructure? And the Chinese are expanding infrastructure. And I think it's kind of interesting. One of the issues that we're going to see is, can the Chinese pay their debts? We talked about it a little last week, but I watched a documentary last night called The New Silk Road. There's also a book that's pretty good about it. And it was filmed in 2019, which seems like forever ago. And they were interviewing some Chinese businessmen in Djibouti, actually, that were working at the port. And they were talking about how they weren't profitable at this point, and they were having loss after loss after loss. But they said Beijing would eat the cost because they were ambitious. And now, I think if you remember, and Jay, you can talk about this article that you sent just recently about Evergrande. And
Yeah.
is China going to be able to pay all of these projects? Are they going to continue this
No.
gravy train of projects? Well, exactly. That's going to be the problem. What happens then? Who takes the
Yeah.
ports? What are they going to do when they call in these loans? They can call in a loan all they want, but are they going to invade this country to try and get their money back? How are they going to pay their debts? Or are they going to pay their debts to us? Are they going to call in the debt they owe, or we owe them? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of factors at play here. And I think that's going to be one of the things that either hurdles us closer to conflict or may keep us out of it, is the economics of it. Is, if China feels that they're in a desperate situation, do they want to go into a conflict to try and save face, or to gain access to resources that they really just don't have? And,
Yeah.
I think that's something that needs to be, and I'm sure there's a lot of very smart people analyzing that as well, but that needs to be one of the central points as well. If China defaults on its debt, what are they going to do now? Because they have all these ambitious projects that are halfway done or completely done, but then there's another phase that they haven't started yet. What are they
Yeah.
going to do?
Yeah. So kind of connecting a few dots here that you've talked about. The specific article that Colin was referring to it's all over the news. The CEO of Evergrande has been apprehended by Chinese police and has basically more or less disappeared. There's been there's been a statement by the CCP that he's in detention for being suspect of committing crimes. Uh,
An
I have
extremely
not seen.
vague accusation, committing
Yeah,
crimes.
and I'm gonna here's Jay's take on this whole situation. When your company, in this case Evergrande, takes a lot of people's money, investors' money, with the promise that they're going to increase it, and then when they, for years now have been a slow train wreck where they've been either defaulting on their loans or they've been telling investors that they're not going to be able to pay them back. Like the way the current CCP functions today is that it's essentially a elitist organization where there are the privileged party members across the country who basically have all the political power. Like, yes, there's elections, but you know, it's it's not just like we vote for the CCP. It's, the elections are kind of pointless. And so you've got these elites, and the elites are also the ones with all the money. Well, when they invest in these companies like Evergrande and Evergrande can't pay them back, all of a sudden the elites who have all the political power start getting angry. And that's when you start seeing these people get arrested because there's got to be somebody to blame. It is in the higher up elites, primarily Xi Jinping's interest to point the blame, point the finger down at somebody like the Evergrande CEO, who I'm sure he did make some really poor decisions along the way, but I can't help but think that he's probably being used as a scapegoat at this point to pacify all of the elites who lost a whole bunch of money in Evergrande. I think we are going to see an increasing trend over the next several years because all probabilities are saying that China's economy is going to get much, much worse in the future. There's some pessimism here in the United States. I was actually talking to somebody today about, we still have the inverted yield curve, which is one of the telltale signs that the economy is not going to do so hot in the next 10 years, regardless of this soft landing that the Fed's trying to get us on. But that's another topic. But I would say what I've seen is there's even significantly more pessimism regarding China's economy over that same time frame. And what that's going to do is it's going to create some serious political issues within China because the elites are the ones with all the money. And when they no longer have that money, they're going to start making political decisions, maybe firing some people, maybe changing hands, this, that, and the other,
Disappearing some people.
disappearing some people. Like the volatility is only going to increase. And I say all that to say, one key mechanism to try to decrease the volatility in your own domestic political structure is to start pointing the blame at other people and organizations outside of your political structure, cough, cough, the United States. To me, it is no accident that the increase in nationalism within China, specifically with the rise of Xi Jinping, that has been an attempt to consolidate power and to reduce domestic chaos because they can just say don't look internally, look over there. Iran has been playing this tactic for years since their economy's gone down the tank. I think we're going to see more of that in the future.
Jay, quick thought here as you said that, where you just mentioned point the finger at the United States, and I kind of alluded to them acting erratically should the money dry up.
Yeah.
Do you think they'll point the finger at the United States but swing the sword at Taiwan? Obviously Taiwan is something that is going to be a huge factor in the next 30 years of China's future history.
The two definitely go hand in hand for sure. They are probably They are probably, so I'm still really torn on how likely I personally believe conflict with Taiwan is going to take place. Honestly, under current circumstances, I would say that conflict over Taiwan within the next 5 years is significantly unlikely. 10 years, I would say it's unlikely. And beyond, just for the sake of proving the point, however, indefinitely, like if we were to extend that time horizon indefinitely, I would say that conflict over Taiwan is extremely likely.
Mm-hmm.
Only because as long as the CCP is still in charge of Taiwan, they are never going to let it go. Never. It is only in
Wait, who's in control of Taiwan?
the DPP. Sorry, did
That's
I
right.
say the CCP in charge
Yeah.
of Taiwan?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Colin, for catching me. As long as the CCP is still in charge of China, China is not going to let Taiwan go.
Yeah. I think that we've alluded to that in the past. And there is one China. There's one
Right.
China. Conflict is inevitable unless something dramatic happens and the CCP goes away. When that conflict occurs, how it occurs, who knows? But I think it would take something monumental, economic collapse, military disaster, something of that nature, where either the CCP loses power or the CCP is put in a position where they have to project power for legitimacy because things are, they don't want fingers pointed inward.
Yeah.
And so that kind of, the other thing I think people need to consider when they start looking and we start making projections into the future based on historical trends, which I think is the most important reason we study history, is to make future projections and understand where things are moving based on historical data, trends, or all that in-depth study of it. I think we talked about it, I think 3 episodes ago, the one child policy and demographics.
Mm-hmm.
Jay, I sent this to you a couple days ago, but I saw a post where they were talking about the number of births in China dropping 50% over the past 5 years.
Yeah.
And as I kind of did my own deep dive into this and reading about it, if that trend were to continue so those children not being born are, and this is a very sanitized way to look at it, but those are future taxpayers. Those are future soldiers. Those are future contributors to the economy and the forward momentum of China. In order to make up for that, like no child being born, somebody would have to have double the amount of kids or have 2 kids to make up for that. That's just not going to happen, nor could you arrest that rate of descent overnight. It's going to take a lot of time and it's going to continue to go down before it starts going back up. I bring that up because China, as we've talked about with the economics, potential military conflict, China will need a tax base to pay for all of these programs. They will need people to pay for all of these things. Beijing's eating the cost. How are they going to get the money if they don't have the taxpayers? How are they going to have the money if they don't have the workers to finish the projects? How are they going to fight a war if their population is aging and dying more dramatically than it is anywhere else in the world? We've already gone over that, and that was just public information that we were able to gather. That may not be accurate. That may be something that has been fudged by the CCP. They're notorious for it. It might have happened. So I think over the next, so let's say those numbers that I referenced were starting in 2015 or 2016. In 30 years, that's 2046. That's basically your fighting age population for the next couple of years, and your prime taxpayers. They're not there anymore. What's China going to do? Their next door neighbor to the south, who they've already been at war with, India, their population is not going down. They're also an ambitious country. Who is going to be the biggest kid on the block in Asia once China attacks Taiwan or decides that they're kind of a stumbling block on their new Silk Road? And maybe India wants to be the big kid on the block. I think that's something to consider. That's much further off in the future.
Yeah.
But I think as we start adding things together, that's a possibility.
Yeah. I'm not sure, because I'm definitely not a Indian scholar by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't see India being a regional competitor against China anytime soon. Yes, they have a large population. There's a ton of really good expertise. Like they have a pretty decent university system. Um, but the reality is that India is ridiculously corrupt.
People said the same thing about China in 1970.
Yeah, that's true, and that's
But
fair.
I
But I
guess that's
think
my
we've
only.
seen China still not. Um,
No. And I'm not saying there will be a conflict. All I'm saying is relating it to demographics, there is an
mm,
issue. I think that's going to be one of the defining things looking forward as the US relates to China. What is China going to do about an aging population? An aging population far larger than the aging population in the US. Right now, we're dealing with boomers. Well, once boomers are gone, Gen X is much smaller than millennials. It's kind of, they're all the same size. It's almost like a column type of population. So,
yeah,
Social Security will be gone, but, at that point, population stabilized. What's China going to do? They're still an inverted pyramid at that point.
yeah,
I think that's going to be one of the things that they're going to have to deal with. And it's going to be something that is central to every decision they make, whether implicitly or explicitly. I'm not saying they may go to conflict with India. I hope they don't, because that would be a lot of lives lost. I'm simply saying that as India's in 50 years, India maybe, have 500 million more people, much larger, 500 million more people than China might, and their population would still be relatively young compared to China's.
yeah, yeah. I personally believe that the more unstable a country it is, the more unstable a country is culturally, politically, like in all the metrics of stability, economically, the more prone to conflict it is. Now, and I think Japan is the quintessential example of Japan, Japan's economy. And we don't talk about this very much, but Japan's society was very much in chaos in 1936 when the Marco Polo Bridge incident happened, 1941 when they attacked the United States and Great Britain and the Dutch and the Philippines. Like there was this ultra nationalist government led by Tojo that was very anti-communist. They wanted to fight the Russians, they wanted to fight the United States, like they wanted economic resources, and that drove them into conflict. So like I see your point, and I don't disagree that yeah, China may want to start a war over Taiwan, but the reality is like their economy is not doing so hot. Their
Right.
demographics are not doing so hot. There's a lot of factors about China that's not doing so hot, but yet I actually think that increases the likelihood for conflict
Hmm.
because people like decision makers aren't necessarily rational. I
No.
think World War One is a great example. If you read Barbara Tuchman's *The Guns of August*, like she does such a good job of describing the feel of what it felt like to be in August of 1914, like even though it didn't make any sense whatsoever to go to war, all of these different, these various monarchies and other countries, they wanted to go to war, even when it didn't make any sense. And
They
that war
felt
lasted.
compelled, even if they didn't want to. They felt compelled, like they had to fight. There's a lot
Yeah.
of, oh man, that is
Well,
such an
Russia,
interesting time.
yeah, and I think Russia is the good example there because Russia, in 1914, they had like their society was not stable. And we all know, was it 1917 when the
Hmm.
October Revolution? Or was it
Yep.
16?
1917.
Right? Like they were only a few years away from completely overthrowing and like completely dismantling their political structure. That doesn't happen without pre-existing conditions being present for a really long time. And yet the Russian aristocracy in 1914 was super excited to go to war. Like they wanted it. And the Tsar was like, heck yeah, this is great. And they were all juiced up on nationalism. They're going to go fight the Germans and the Austrians to protect the Serbs and their Slavic brothers. And it did not work out well for Russia.
No.
Like it didn't make any freaking sense.
Well,
So
it didn't make sense for anybody. I don't want to get sidetracked. That was such a Do another
My
podcast
point
about
is
that.
like, right. My point is that as we see, like, it is cause for concern as we see China begin destabilization. And that word begin is extremely important because, and as you were talking, Colin, I was thinking about the Qing dynasty. Like, the Opium Wars happened in the
1842,
1830s, 1840s, right?
41.
Right. The Qing dynasty was still around for another 70 years. Yeah, it was like 1910, 1911 when Yuan Shikai and Sun Yat-sen, did their
Puyi was whisked off to the Forbidden City.
right. Like, that's a long time. I think so. Kind of going back to what we were saying about like likelihoods of conflict over Taiwan. I think we will see a conflict over Taiwan before we see the CCP collapse. I don't think that we have seen any indication that the CCP is on the brink of losing their grip on the Chinese political structure anytime soon. And just to kind of close the point here, it's like the Qing dynasty lost some major wars in the Opium Wars. The Taiping Rebellion didn't happen for another, 15 or 20 years, right? It's like the 1850s, 1860s,
Yeah,
maybe
1850s.
ish. I'm kind of shooting from the hip there. The Boxer Rebellion wasn't for another 40 to 50 years after that, right? In 1900. And the Qing dynasty survived. They survived the Taiping Rebellion. They survived the Boxer Rebellion. They survived numerous other attempts, localized attempts to remove them from power. And they survived. And it wasn't until just, they kind of whimpered away when, the little baby Puyi was whisked away and it kind of went out with a whimper. So I think there's a lot of people that kind of predict the collapse of the CCP is like inevitable, and they've been saying that for years, if not over a decade. I disagree with that. I think that we're nowhere close to seeing the CCP go anywhere, and it's more likely that a conflict with Taiwan will happen before the CCP goes anywhere.
Jay, you made a great point without even realizing it, I think.
Ooh.
A lot of people have been predicting the fall. To expand on that, I think because of, I don't know if it's Hollywood or, everybody knows when you say Armageddon, everybody knows what that is. But that kind of defines our ideas of how civilizations and dynasties fall. Like Rome, all of these other ones, we think it's this epic battle, and at the last gasp, the empire falls. That is almost never how it happens.
Yeah.
That's a plug for a future podcast series, FYI.
We just gave a hint on what our next series is going to be.
But with China, you're right. The Qing dynasty existed for 70 years, 80 years almost, in getting the snot kicked out of them before they finally went away.
Right.
That's the same thing's going to happen with the CCP no matter what. There's not going to be this Black Friday economic event where all the money's gone to zero and everybody panics and it just suddenly evaporates. That's just not how
it's not
human nature.
Like
it's decades. It is decades. Right. And then finally, it's kind of like the end of the Soviet Union. It wasn't like the Berlin Wall came down and everything ended in this. They just decided to surrender at the U.S. firepower. It was that they ran out of money and the ability to run the government. And it was like Kazakhstan was the last member of the Soviet Union, little known fact. But these countries just started saying, hey, we're free. And the Soviet Union just said, hey, okay, we can't really do anything. Sorry. And then they just dissolved. In like 91, it was just kind of like every country was like, hey, we're kind of done with this. We're going to self-determination. We're going to go do our own thing.
Yep.
And that was years and years and years and years and years in the making. It wasn't an overnight event. I think that's how people need to start perceiving how the CCP is going to behave over the next few years. If they are on the decline, which they may or may not be, we're speculating off of evidence that we're seeing now in historical trends.
Yeah.
If they're on the decline, it's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be in 5 years. It's not going to be in 10. It's going to be in decades from now.
Yeah. I will say, though, actually, let me say two things. The first one, it's not a guarantee that the CCP will ever fall.
Yeah, exactly.
I think Great Britain and the United States are two good examples of where, like, you can have extremely destructive civil wars, and your political entity it changes a little bit, but like, if you think about the American political system, we didn't stop being a democratic republic. Like, Congress didn't change. We didn't do what the French have done over, the last couple hundred years. And that is like literally changed from being a monarchy to a republic to a parliamentary republic back to a
Bring back
monarchy.
Napoleon.
Like, yeah, you know, it just because you have even a civil war, that doesn't mean that your political structure is going to fundamentally change. The English Civil Wars in the 1600s and the American Civil War in the 1800s. Like, I say that to say, like, China could have a straight up civil war, and it's not a guarantee it could. It just depends on who wins.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, though, and this is my second thought, is I personally do not see the CCP as a sustainable political institution. And I would just go right back to the Soviet Union as the best example for that. I don't know when it's going to collapse, but I can't help but think it's going to collapse at some point. And I, call me biased, but I can't help but think, you need some kind of democratic system in order to be sustainable. And the Soviet Union showed us, and just the current totalitarianism that we're seeing in China today, I don't believe it's sustainable. But I don't believe it's going to collapse anytime soon.
With that being said, how does the U.S. navigate that and avoid conflict with China? What should we do to try and avoid a conflict with them, understanding that that's probably not a sustainable way to a political system right now?
Yeah. It's kind of funny. I don't know if you've noticed this, Colin, because we haven't talked about it, but one of the buzzwords in like American pop culture right now is boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Have you noticed that?
It is.
Like,
yes.
Everyone, like, you scroll through your Instagram reels or whatever, and everyone's like, here's the 5 boundaries you need to have with your partner. Like, all this stuff, right? So maybe I'm showing my millennial side here, but I think one of the most helpful things that the United States can do to navigate, potential conflict with China is we got to have some boundaries here. And what I mean by that is the United States is not going to initiate a conflict with China. There's tons of historical evidence to show that the United States, who we are as a country, our historical past, like, we are not going to start a conflict with China. But at the same time, we do have plenty of interests, and kind of, drawn back on this historical theme. The United States just wants a free, open, and robust trading relationship with the Chinese. And then I thought about this when you were giving your recap earlier, and didn't mention it, but I will now. And that is, the United States has always had a moral interest in China. Some of the most popular things that was coming out of, post Treaty of Wangxia, shout out to our first episode in the series. We immediately started sending missionaries. And some of the biggest news articles back in the 1800s was about particularly American women, who were extremely vocal about abolishing the practice of foot binding. That's an early example, but Americans have always been concerned about human rights issues, freedom of speech issues, freedom of religion issues. Heck, you're thinking about the Uyghurs, just a basic right to life and anti-genocide position. Like, we have always had a moral interest. I mean, even President Bill Clinton, we talked about either last episode or episode before last, about like making the trading relationship dependent upon human rights issues. So say that to say, going forward, it's perfectly fine to have a robust trading relationship with China. I don't think we have anything against the Chinese people, and we want to like have a market relationship, i.e. the exchange of goods, the exchange of money, the exchange of services, those kinds of things. like we want that, but the boundaries have got to be like, okay, if you CCP make the decision to invade a country who is not hostile to you, i.e. Taiwan, or even, there's China maintains territorial disputes with Japan over the Senkakus, with the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia. We haven't mentioned it yet, but recently the 9-dash line has expanded to the 10-dash line in the South China Sea. And that 10th dash now encompasses Taiwan, interestingly enough. So, China, if they were to forcefully compel another country, like just from a basic United Nations and international law standpoint, it's like we have to maintain that boundary. We have to be willing to say, okay, somebody has to stand up and say, we are not going to tolerate this kind of behavior. And I fully support, an international coalition saying like, no, maintaining the post-World War II international order. There are rules and you will play by the rules. And if you don't, we can and will compel you to do so. That's not American imperialism. That's the UN and the principles upon which UN was founded and what, these over 100 nations agreed to when they signed the UN Charter.
Jay, I can't help but ask, what do you think the next 10 to 20 years are going to look like?
I'm going to make what might be considered a bold prediction by some and a safe prediction by others. I personally believe the next 20 years are going to be the status quo. I don't see China invading Taiwan. I don't see any significant escalation happening anytime soon. I don't see a collapse of the CCP. I think it's going to be more of the same. Hopefully, a lot of this depends on Xi Jinping. He's in his 60s. Within the next 20 years, he's highly likely to die just due to age. I think he does not want, he's going to see Vladimir Putin, and he's not going to want his legacy to be that of a failed attempt. And unless it becomes extremely clear, and sorry to be clear, a failed attempt of invading Taiwan, unless it becomes extremely clear that he's highly likely to succeed, he probably won't do it. And I don't think we have any reason to believe that if China were to attempt that they would be successful anytime soon.
I want to make a bold prediction and say that in the next 8 to 10 years, there is a conflict over Taiwan.
Oof.
I think there's a lot of publications out there.
Defend yourself.
There's a lot of think tanks that have been predicting 2026, 2028. I think it's closer to 2030. I think there's whatever next economic or international crisis there is, similar to COVID or whatever, that pushes the internal pressures in China. It forces them to make a rash decision. And I think that's the decision that they choose to invade China or to invade Taiwan. I don't know what that conflict will look like. That's beyond me at this point. Whether the US and China get into a hot war, I don't know. Whether it's we don't even back Taiwan at all, or whether we're dropping nukes on Beijing. I don't know what that looks like. But I think in 8 to 10 years, there's a conflict. I think within 20 to 25, there is a massive internal political upheaval in China, probably around Xi Jinping's death and his successors. Who knows what that's going to look like? So I think that's within 20 to 25. I think the economic, I do think that the invasion of Taiwan goes very poorly for China. Maybe they take over the island. Maybe they take over the island, but I think it goes very, very poorly and sets up the following decade where conditions are ripe for political upheaval and turmoil internally. I think that's what the next 20 to 25 years brings us.
Yeah. I would also, you bring up a really good point about, I agree with you that when Xi Jinping dies, that will very much be a crisis point for the CCP. Just the way he does business is very similar to Mao. I think China was very fortunate that someone like Deng Xiaoping was around. A shrewd moderate was able to kind of take the reins from Mao. There's no guarantee that there will be another Deng once Xi passes. So that will definitely be a crisis moment, and we'll see what happens.
Great point. And just to kind of wrap things up, Jay, what it's kind of an interesting, fun question, but what do you wish every Chinese citizen knew about the U.S.? Short and sweet. What do you think? What do you wish they knew
Yeah.
about the U.S.?
We don't hate you. And yeah, and I've kind of made this point a few different times in a few different episodes, but it's like one of the more unfortunate things, that's putting it mildly, things about what's going on in China today is there's like this North Korean-esque educational system where average Chinese citizens are being taught by the CCP that America writ large hates them, and that we are just chomping at the bit to destroy their civilization, do all these things. And it's just like, it's not true. If you were to go, if ironically, I think this is one reason why China is trying to curtail student visas here to the United States, is because like these students come here and they're like, oh, wait a minute, it's not bad at all. It's actually kind
I
of nice.
like it.
SoCal is one of the most beautiful places on the planet. Like, like there's all these reasons. Florida is great. Like it doesn't fit the narrative. And like I hope, average Chinese person could just know average American literally, like, it's not that they don't care. It's just that we have nothing against China. Honestly, one of the ironies here is, I think our listeners will know that Collin and I are fairly anti-communist from an ideological and practical standpoint. But at the same time, like, it's not really our generation's thing to blame all of our national woes on the commies, as, maybe generations before us, that was a thing, that grew up during the Cold War and, had to deal with the Vietnamese, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Soviets. With that being said, it's like, even though China is a communist country, I think average American everyday citizen just like is just kind of neutral about China. There's nothing to hate. We don't love China. I don't think there's a cultural fascination, so to speak, although there have been times in American history where there has been a cultural fascination with China. And I guess the reason why I want them to know that we don't hate them is I think that would deflate a lot of the contention between us and them. Is, we don't hate you guys. We're not out to get you. Let's peaceably move about our business.
It's a good answer.
Well, Collin, let me ask you a similar but slightly flipped question. What do you wish every American could know about China?
Communism does not define China. And what I mean by that is communism has existed in China since the early 1920s, but it hasn't been the dominant political party since 1949. There are thousands of years of history. As we've talked about, there are recent decades where a lot of moderate Chinese culture has emerged from the shackles of communism. And it doesn't, similar to what you're saying, like the average American doesn't hate the average Chinese person and vice versa. Like the average Chinese person is not a bloodthirsty Bolshevik. Does not define the country or the people or the culture. It is a very large part of it right now because that is the dominant political party, and they make a lot of decisions, so they control the daily lives. However, it does not define the way that they think, doesn't define a lot of their future decision making, and there's a lot more to the country and its people than just communism. And I think we get sucked into the trap where we associate like North Korea, China, the Soviet Union, kind of all Cuba, all kind of together, and we lump them into communist bad, communist all the same. And that it's really not. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of uniqueness to each of them.
Yeah, no, that's good. I like that.
Last question: to ban TikTok, yes or no?
No.
Ban it. Get rid of it.
Now. I knew that was going to happen.
Throw it out. Throw it out. Get out of here.
Here's why. Should you have TikTok on your phone? Abso-freaking-lutely not. Your data, and not just the data like that's on TikTok, literally all the data on your phone is going straight to a server somewhere in China. Like when you download that app and you accept the permissions, like you just open the door for the Chinese government, the CCP, to take all of your information. We could do a whole nother episode, but long story short, listeners, there has been a law in China for quite some time that all information that Chinese businesses collect, whether that's collection on Chinese citizen or in the case of ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, it's international users as well. All information must be shared with the Chinese government. Now, that doesn't mean that they're actively looking at it, because frankly, they probably don't care about, the CCP doesn't really care about you or about me. They might care about Collin because he's a stud. Yeah, and on the list. But nevertheless, I think that's enough to where you shouldn't have it on your phone. Now,
ban it, get rid of it.
I actually agree with Rand Paul, who, as much as I disagree with libertarians, I actually agree with Rand Paul that if we were to ban TikTok here in this country, we become one step closer to being more like the CCP. I think freedom of speech, freedom of business is important, freedom of commerce, and I'm not quite there to just ban TikTok. Put constraints on it, etc. But
in 2 minutes or less, I'm going to say banning TikTok is the same reason we don't give cocaine to toddlers. Not only are the Chinese absolutely 100% collecting all of your data and spying on you, there's a reason government agencies do not have TikTok on their phone, and government employee. If you go into any kind of sensitive or secret space, you can't take your phone because the Chinese are going to take all your data. The algorithm and the absolute setup of TikTok and most social media now is designed to keep you addicted in this dopamine. It's a never-ending dopamine drip. They call it doom scrolling for a reason. It's to keep you so mindlessly addicted. And there's evidence, irrefutable evidence at this point, that they are that the Chinese government, or ByteDance, not really Chinese, ByteDance at the behest of the Chinese government are pushing socially, how should I say this? They're pushing things that cause social decay on TikTok to get you addicted, to influence people whose minds are not yet fully developed. So that's my biggest problem with it. They're taking 8th graders who don't really have a fully formed worldview, nor do they have a fully formed frontal cortex. And they are throwing massive amounts of information.
Don't add us. It's science.
Exactly. Their brains are not capable of processing information in this way. You're overloading it. They're getting burnt out. And there's a reason suicide is so high. There's a reason that their depression and all of these things are so high. And it's not just TikTok. It's a lot of social media in general. I say ban TikTok because it's foreign intervention. It's the equivalent of the opium wars, but in reverse, where the European powers were flooding the market with opium. They're flooding the market with dopamine via TikTok. We should take that as an affront. And we should ban it. Fentanyl. That's another thing. They are flooding the U.S. They are flooding the U.S. market. But see, fentanyl, generally speaking, is going to affect mostly a lower class because they lace it in crack and cocaine and things like that. So chances are there's not a 13-year-old from suburbia going to get fentanyl. There is a 13-year-old with TikTok. They are getting TikTok. So they can't get them from fentanyl. They're going to get them on TikTok. Absolutely. Yeah. First off, we 100% should be looking into how so much fentanyl is getting across the border and where it's coming from, because we know where it's coming from. The same place that TikTok is. So that's why I say we ban TikTok, for the safety of the children. I will appeal to your emotions to save the children.
You may have successfully changed my mind. However, I will modify my position because you do have a compelling argument here. I'm not in favor of giving cocaine to babies.
No true Scotsman.
I do believe, even though this is why I'm not a libertarian, by the way, we do need to regulate social media. I think some conservatives that listen to our podcast may have just cringed at me saying that, but I do believe I'm not an anarchist. The government does need to do something. We should regulate TikTok. And if ByteDance and the CCP cannot comply, then, ban it under those kinds of things. But
you need to ban it and then reintroduce it slowly, like a controlled burn. You can reintroduce it slowly later. But right now, if you were to uninstall TikTok on every 13-year-old's phone right now, people would go into a meltdown. That's a problem. Yeah. That's called addiction. That's a chemical addiction.
Yeah, no, you're right.
That's a problem. So maybe we should go ahead and go cold turkey for a little bit and then say, okay, now we can reintroduce it with constraints, because this has been shown. They don't show videos of kids doing sensual dances or sexually explicit images to children in China. They're showing them things that are socially acceptable, like studying.
It's definitely a propaganda outlet.
It's 100% a propaganda out. But what are they peddling to American kids? Being a social degenerate, how to ruin your life. Here's things. They're literally pushing videos on suicide and depression to children. That is absolutely happening on TikTok. It's documented. There's people who are way smarter than me that can explain the algorithms and how they work. That's my biggest problem with it. It's a threat to the children. And heck, it's a threat to middle-aged people that just get addicted. Your brain physically cannot stop it. That's the thing. It's doom scrolling for a reason. Your brain can't do it. I've never walked outside and not seen 3/4 of the people on their phone doom scrolling Instagram or TikTok. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Maybe we need to go cold turkey as a country for a little bit.
Well,
that's a topic for another day, though.
I'll tell you what we don't want you to go cold turkey from, and what we absolutely want you to be addicted to, the Loins of History podcast.
That's a great close. Great segue.
Yeah. No, and with that, we hope you doom scroll all of our episodes and all of our content. And please follow us on social media and give us a 5-star review and a review on whatever podcast platform you follow us on. As always, if we get a 5-star review and a comment, we will give you a shout out on our next episode. So that is the best way to support this podcast, is to give us that 5-star review. It tells the very algorithm that we were condemning that you like our content, and that it will recommend it to other people. You can also email us if you're into that kind of thing. Give us some feedback. Tell us we suck. Tell us what you want us to play next. Tell us that you appreciate it. And we will correspond with you there. We are on Facebook, Instagram. Both Collin and I have Twitters.
We're not on TikTok yet, so all of the things I said.
We're definitely not on TikTok. We're definitely not on TikTok. I'd say Instagram is our primary thing.
It's the millennial TikTok.
Yeah, so we've got one more episode in our China and U.S. relations. I'm going to keep it a secret on what we're doing next, but one more, and then we're going to start our next series. If you caught our hint earlier and you want to guess at what the next series is, give us a comment and tell us what you think it might be. And yeah, we will see everyone next week on the Loins of History.